hindquarters. Basically what I like to do is take off the sirloin bit and the sirloin tips together, and then I take the rounds off together. And you know, you don't have to worry about beef chart and names and all that stuff. Here's the inside of the leg. It basically sits on the deer like this. This is the front. This is the front. This is the back. You can see this main separation here, and your bone runs along this main separation. So what I do is I go right to the bone and I cut that straight off. Just like this. When I get down to the main bone, to the joint there, I turn my knife around that joint and I cut that straight off. I'm trying to get a camera where you can see this thing. Angle where you can see this thing. So you got your sirloin attached to your sirloin tips. Don't worry about all the names though. That kind of stuff really doesn't matter. Alright. Then the same thing in here. Once you start boning this thing out, you're basically just going to follow these seams. To get your rounds off. I'm just going to follow along all the seams inside that ham. It's not rocket science. You can't really mess it up. Even if you mess it up a little, you're still going to get a few good steaks and some good stew meat. Alright, so there's your top round connected to your eye round. And a lot of people with the deer like to leave that eye round attached. I don't think it makes good steak. So I separate that muscle out, and that goes in my stew pot. It's just a little tough. So here's a little bit of sirloin still attached to this round. I'll cut that off. That can be trimmed up and made into its own little single steak. And then basically, I'll fillet all the silver off. And just like filleting a fish, I'll lay that down. And I'll just fillet all that silver right off of there. This is where having a long, flexible knife comes in handy. All that fat cap. That'll go in a separate bowl of just trimmings. And that's usually scrap for me. I'll feed it to my dogs. But anyway, there's your nice muscle. I'll trim it up, even it up again to where it's all relatively the same thickness. This goes in the stew pot. This gets cut into steaks. Pull out my steak knife for that, my butcher knife. This makes beautiful steaks, and they are tender and delicious when grilled to medium rare perfection. This little end one, pretty little deer steaks. Marinate those, grill them medium rare, just doesn't get any better. I'm going to take this next large muscle off. Just fillet it right off the bone. in the same fashion that you did everything else. Don't worry about messing it up, you know. Any little pieces that are left are stew meat. This whole shank, stew meat, makes great stew. Anything that looks like a vein or got a fat, you got fat in it, you don't want that in your meat. Trust me. Veins and those fat wads in the hams all have glands in them, and again, they don't taste very well. Keep peeling that down until you got a solid muscle. And I got my buddy here waiting on a scrap. Stew meat. Now, nice muscle here. Just keep trimming and trimming until you get a nice, pretty, symmetrical piece of muscle. The better you trim these up, the better your steaks are going to look. Once you get it where you want it, then you start slicing your steaks. You can see the striations in the muscle going this way. You want to cut against the grain. You can feel how tender that is when you're cutting it. Once you start getting some resistance on the ends where it gets shanky, throw that in the stew pot. There's some nice choice steaks, and I just package those as steak. Again, I don't mess with the beef chart. That's the steaks that I get out of the rounds. We'll go to the sirloin and the tips now. Alright, this is the piece that you cut off of the front of the ham. You want to separate this chunk from this nice round chunk. Alright, and again, you're just going to follow this seam all the way around till you separate out that nice muscle there. Stew and clean that up. I'll show you cleaning up this stuff, how I clean this stuff up. But that muscle right there, now it's in several different groups. This is sirloin tips, but it still makes good steaks. So what I'll do is I'll cut the end off, cut this end off, get me about 4 steaks out of that thing. Cut that shanky end off. That goes in your stew meat. Then take a nice, you can see the striations going this way. You want to cut against the grain. And I usually get about 4 steaks out of that. That goes in the stew. Now this sirloin portion, I'll just fillet it off. It's kind of marbly, but it's real tender. I'll fillet it off, and I'll make 1 steak out of that just like it is. Trim it up just a little bit for presentation purposes, but That is a delicious piece of meat. It's not the prettiest piece of meat, but it's delicious grilled. So there's your tips, your sirloin, and your rounds. Beautiful steaks right there. Do the same thing with the other ham. For this shank, I don't get too excited about it. I just get it off the bone. Like I said, makes beautiful stew meat. I'll peel a piece off, get the skin side down against the table, and fillet that silver skin off of it, like so. Just to get the dirty parts, you know, that still have a little hair and dirt on them. Don't worry about these tendons, man. I'm telling you, you cook these tendons down, they're delicious. Even the hamstring is a delicious piece of meat. Got anything on there you need to fillet off, just fillet it off. You can't mess it up. Don't worry about it. You're not going to mess it up. It's stew meat. Every decent sized chunk of meat on there is good eating. Want stewed down. Pretty clean. Good to go. For these back straps, again, you can see where this marbling starts here. And you get it into your ribeye section and your neck section. What I like to make steaks out of is this portion right here, this back portion, where it's all relatively the same thickness. It cooks up great on the grill. So I'll come back to where this, you can see this other muscle joining in right here, and I'll cut that sucker off right there. Alright? And this is what I make my steak out of. Again, got some sinew there, some silver skin. I just flip that over. Just like filleting a fish, fillet that right off. Now, if I miss a little bit like I did there, I just fillet that off, put that in my stew meat. No big deal. This is the best usable sinew on a deer if you want to save sinew for arrows or whatever. This is the good stuff. Alright, this kind of comes down to a point on the side of this muscle. I'll cut that off to where it's flat. Again, you're looking for a uniform thickness when you're grilling a steak. Alright, that goes in my stew meat. I'll clean the meat off of that. That goes the scrap. This will go in my stew meat. Just want to give that a good trim. Like I said, make it nice and uniform. And then I'll cut that into 2 individual steaks. And I'll package that together as backstrap. And that is delicious cutlets of meat right there. Grill that medium rare, then you slice it into steaks after it's grilled medium rare. Trust me, it'll turn out a lot more tender and a lot better for you. Makes a nice presentation when the family's over too. That goes in the steak bowl. Okay, so here's a front quarter. And you know, traditionally with beef, there's some steaks on a front quarter. You got your mock tenders, you got your flat irons, but no matter how I've tried to prepare these as steaks, I've never got them to turn out well. So basically, this whole front quarter, for me, gets ground or cut into stew meat. And there's nothing to it. You're just cutting the meat off the bone, guys. I start on the inside of the paddle. Remove all this trimmings. You can see the this little spine that sticks out off the shoulder blade. You know, we'll go on both sides of that. Start peeling. Once you get clear of the paddle, I just cut this chunk of meat right off. Okay. Same thing with the flat iron. Just filleting it off the bone. And again, it's stew meat, so I don't get too darn particular with how I cut it off. Come in here, come around the paddle. Shoulder blade, I call it a paddle. Back to that main knuckle, stew meat. Same thing on the other side. So, you know, here's my stew meat off of half of this deer. You can see right there, you know, I'm getting a pile of it. And I probably, you know, if you have access to a grinder, I'll end up grinding about half of that and just packaging the other as stew. But whether you're going to make hamburger or stew, you just want to come in here and clean it up. If you see anything you don't like, just fillet that sinew off of there. You know, that goes in your trimmings. And you're just chunking this up into stew meat size, whatever size you want it. Pretty simple process. Again, don't underestimate this stuff right here, guys. I'm telling you, it makes a delicious stew. You take out some of that silver skin layer there, but you really don't have to. You stew it long enough, that stuff turns to gelatin, and it's absolutely delicious. About time to steal the old knife here. This is the second deer I've done with that rata today. Anyway, I want it to come out looking something like that. Package up it, you know, enough to make a stew. Cool. I'll finish trimming this up and I'll show you the finished product. So there it all is, guys. Nice board full of steaks. Probably 15-20 pounds of steak there. And probably 10 pounds of trimmings. Maybe 15 pounds of, you know, stew meat or hamburger, whatever you want. Of course, you know, that whole deer was processed with just a knife.